Welcome to Uprising, Bridgid.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, it seems as though your book is written primarily for the modern American working mother, and that may not be just because you happen to be a working mother and wrote it. As you allude to, it seems to be that it's often working mothers who are juggling the work, life, and play with far greater difficulty than at least compared to men. Is that true?
Well, it has been true, and I think one of the most important things that I discovered in my research is that men are beginning to feel as much or even more work-life conflict than mothers are, because what's happening now is that you've got men who want to, if you will, lean out or lean back and be more than just the distant dad or the provider. They want to be a full partner and not just the helper fun dad, and they're finding it just as difficult to try to find out the way to juggle because our workplaces haven't changed really since the 1950s. We still expect the best workers to be the ones without caregiving responsibilities.
Do we spend less time with our children today than parents used to? And why is it that parents feel so guilty all the time these days about just not spending enough time with their kids?
Well, that's one of the things that I found most fascinating and counterintuitive, really, because as a working mother, I always felt very guilty, and I felt like I never spent enough time with my kids. And there were lots of different newspaper articles, magazine articles that came out that were talking, particularly in the early 90s, oh, working parents abandon their children. So I think that there was this sort of cultural feeling that we were doing that and feeling badly about it. And what I discovered in the course of researching my book, there was a time study that came out that found that working parents were not spending as much time with their kids. It turns out that was wrong. It was actually incorrect data, and by the time the researcher corrected it, it was too late. That story had already gotten out there. But as a result of feeling that guilt, when you look at the work hours, or when you look at the hours that parents spend with their children, since the 1980s, it's actually been on the rise.
Right.
So now you have working mothers, even when they work full time, are spending as much or more time with their children than at-home moms did in the 60s and 70s. And you think, how is that possible?
Right.
It's possible because they're doing less housework, they've given up sleep, personal care, and almost all of their leisure time is spent with their children.
And so that has coupled with our own notions of parenting that have changed dramatically. We hover much more around our kids than we used to. We supervise them constantly. We schedule them for classes and for games, and we're shuttling them from place to place. How has that contributed?
It's huge. And you know what? The most important thing I found is don't do that. It's not good for the kids, and it's not good for us. And so much of that comes from our fear of the future. You know, we're in this period of massive economic change and globalization, and nobody really knows what the keys to success for the future are. So we pour all of this energy and time into our kids. We're so afraid that we want to prepare them for the future. So the cello lessons and the soccer and the lacrosse and blah. And what we're finding is that when you give kids unscheduled time to figure out who they are, what they're passionate about, what they like, let them fail, get bored and learn how to get unbored, how to pick themselves up from failure, that they develop grit and resilience, and that is what's going to help them have a more successful, happy future rather than a ton of lessons and then they get to college and all of a sudden they don't know who they are and what they like anymore.
What about the corporate ethic around work? You said how the ideal worker is still one that doesn't have any parenting responsibilities, and yet you discuss how the way in which women entering the workforce and men feeling like they need to be better parents and more present parents has changed. So is it just that the corporate work ethic just hasn't caught up with today's reality?
I think that's a lot of it. That's absolutely so true. And one of the messages in my book is particularly since the 80s, the 1980s, you see work hours increasing for white-collar workers, and at the same time you see for, say, blue-collar workers, working-class folks, that their work hours are falling, but that's because they're needing to cobble together 2 and 3 jobs because wages have stagnated as costs have increased. So you've kind of got these two different things happening that are creating this sense of overwhelm. But when it comes to corporate America, a huge message of my book is that these long hours at work, they're not producing the best work. That when you look at international comparisons, there are other countries who are more productive per hour than we are. And that includes all of those countries like France and Denmark. Norway is actually beats us by a mile
Wow.
in hourly productivity. And that's because we just spend a lot of time at the office, and we're really little more than butts in a chair after a while.
And so that's a really great question that comes up or brings up, which is that we hear about Europeans and their generous vacations, their 2 and 3 hour lunches. Why is it that they're more productive then? Is it also that one big difference, of course, with Europeans is that their governments do support workers better, but then is it also that in their culture they just tend to worry less than we do?
Well, in terms of worry, the United States, the World Health Organization has said that we are the most anxious country in the world. Well, and when you think about that, it's not like we're in the middle of a famine or a civil war. There are lots of other countries that are in truly stressful situations. Why is it that we're so anxious? So that's important. But when you look at what is it that makes a country productive, or how could they get those hourly productivity measures? Well, you look at the 8-hour workday here in the United States. That's an artifact of Henry Ford bringing in consultants to his assembly line, trying to figure out how far can you push a manual laborer before they get tired and start making costly mistakes. Well, in a knowledge economy, we don't know how far you can push a knowledge worker, so to speak. And so I think it's a great example of when you work short, intense, bounded hours. France just passed a law that for certain workers, you are not allowed to answer work emails or texts or cell phone calls out of hours. But there are companies I found here, sort of bright spots, if you will, that are already doing that here because they're looking at human performance science and emerging neuroscience that's showing our brain is always constantly seeking novelty. And so when you are able to completely turn off and change the channel, and you are with your family, or you're kayaking, or going for a walk, or you're having a full life outside of work, you're going to come back in the next day, and you're not only going to be more refreshed and happier, but your brain will have seen new connections, and you'll be able to solve old problems in new ways. It actually makes you more innovative.
Well, we know, of course, there's a gender difference in how we view and spend our time, as we started out talking about, and then you alluded to the difference between blue-collar and white-collar workers, and people having to juggle 2 or 3 jobs. So what is the difference that we see in other demographics, such as class and also such as race?
That's huge. If people with resources and education in the middle and upper middle class are feeling overwhelmed and busy, can you imagine then what that's like for people without education or resources? When you don't have government support, we do not have the safety nets that other countries do have. When you have to take 2 and 3 buses to stand in some long line to try to get some piece of paper to get into some other line, our systems that are set up to supposedly undergird working families without means don't really work very well. And I think one of the most important things is in terms of scheduling, that for a lot of low-wage workers, not only do they not have living wages, there is no city in the United States where a worker earning minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. That's huge, and a lot of people have families, so our structures are sort of at a disconnect, and a lot of them have very unpredictable hours. And we know that stress comes from 2 things: an inability to predict and a lack of control. And at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, you can't do either one of those things, so the stress is really unimaginable.
Now, let's talk about the idea around unpaid work done by stay-at-home moms, but also working mothers who are doing home work. How does that enter into the conversation around time? There are, I understand, some countries that have actually attempted to pay women for the housework that they do.
Well, there are different countries that have come up with different policies. For instance, in France and Germany, they, when you look at the different reasons for different sort of family or life-friendly policies, kind of why. And in France and Germany, they lost so much of their population during the just horrendous wars of the 20th century. They wanted to find a way to encourage people to have babies. And so since women were educated and working, they wanted to find a way to support working families. So you have a higher birth rate in France. Well, in France, you can also deduct the cost of a maid. You have the paid parental leave. You have
health care that's free.
Health care that's free. Yes, you have high quality, subsidized child care that's available. And it's high quality. You have child care workers who are well trained, well paid, and part of the same unions as the professors at the Sorbonne. Whereas here in the United States, we have no standards. Child care is actually more expensive in 30 states than college, and our workers are paid about the same as bellhops and parking lot attendants. So there's a real disconnect in terms of the supports that we have for working families here.
So then what is the sort of answer in a nutshell to why Americans are so overwhelmed? Is it essentially all of the above, that we have, our government has different support structures, or far worse support structures? There's a wage issue. There is the cultural and corporate issue. All of those things add up to a harried, overwhelmed American worker that is most typically a working mother.
So what have you got to do? You need to change the definition of work. You need to blow up the workplace, rewire it. You know, when people talk about leaning into the workplace, that's important, yes, but my question is, lean into what? We need to change that workplace to make it more, to be about real work rather than long hours that then tend to reward the people who can stay those long hours, who tend to not have caregiving responsibilities. We need to value those caregiving responsibilities, value that invisible labor, reimagine our relationships so that we can have a fairer division of labor, so that women are not still doing twice the housework and twice the childcare like they still are, even when they're working full time. And the most important thing, or an important thing I should say, is recapture the value of leisure and downtime and free time for ourselves, for our kids. That being busy, this is where we show our status nowadays. It really is not gonna. It's not gonna serve you. And at the end of your life, what's it gonna have meant? What's it going to add up to?
There was a recent story about how women working at Harvard were making great strides on equality with men in the workplace in Harvard itself, but at home, the survey found that women who worked at Harvard were working twice as much at home as men, and that probably didn't surprise you.
No, not at all. There was a woman who won the Nobel Prize for Science, and when they called her to let her know, she was folding the laundry. You know, that's not...
While her husband was kicking up his legs. And how much of this is, even reading your book, you describe your own husband when you're picking up the kids' clothes, he's kicking back and smoking a cigar. And, you know, it's just like, that makes me angry.
Oh, yeah, believe me, when I read the first draft of that chapter, it's called The Stalled Gender Revolution, I called it my rage draft because I was so angry. But it really took me a long time to see how we got there, and how I was just as much a part of that. We had agreed to be these equal partners when we got married, but think about it. We're really at the kind of bleeding edge of change in gender roles. We didn't have any role models. There was nobody that I could look to say, that's what I want to do. I want to do what they're doing. So we were trying to figure it out, and it really changed when we had our first child. And that's when we started to slide into these traditional gender roles. Right. And the time studies actually will show that happens around the world. You have to be really aware of that. Our workplace structures, they trap men in ways that I hadn't realized before. For instance, my husband never took parental leave, even though his workplace at the time had that on the books. And so as part of this research for the book, we would go on these long walks, and I took my reporter's notebook and I started interviewing him about our life to try to understand it. How did it get so out of whack? And he said, you know, yes, I knew that there was this policy, but no man ever took it because it was the kiss of death. You were not seen as a productive or committed worker if you took it. And those cultural attitudes still hold sway today. I also had to see how I became completely entranced by this notion of being the ideal mother. And we both thought that I was just, quote unquote, naturally wired to do it. And I think that was fascinating to me in doing this research, to find that men are also wired for nurture, and that it's okay to step back and share the load, that it's actually better for the kids and it's better for your relationship as well.
Now, there have been many fields of study on humans that are finding that because of rapid industrialization and how our whole civilization has become a civilization in such a short amount of time, that our evolution hasn't caught up with how we're living today. What do we know from human behavior as it evolved during hunter-gatherer periods that informs this work-play balance that we keep trying to achieve?
Well, I think the best thing we could do is go back to the Pleistocene era. You know, and how were we organized then? We have this mistaken view that men went off to hunt and women stayed around the cave and tended the fire. And that, that's sort of like one of the stories we tell ourselves. But in reality, what happened is that men would go off to hunt, yes, and in some cases women went too, or in some tribes women went off to hunt. But in most of those hunter-gatherer societies, women walked thousands of miles to forage and to gather all of the stuff that you needed.
All with babies strapped to their backs, maybe? Or
sometimes with the babies strapped to their backs, but more importantly, plenty of times when the babies were left back at the camp with dads, grandparents.
They were the gatherers.
Well, there's a word for it. They called them alloparents. That we have always, the reason that that human beings evolved is that we're what they call cooperative breeders. We have always helped each other raise the next generation. And what's different now in our modern era is that we expect mothers to do it all. And we've never expected that before, and it's too much. We need to get back to that sense that it is a communal responsibility. And I will tell you why that's so important is because when you look at our birth rates around the country in places that do not address these issues of work-life balance, say in Italy or Spain or Japan, where there's a very conservative streak, where they still think dad goes to work, mom stays home, that's the best, the best family. And we have a really strong streak of that here in the United States, that when you have not fully addressed how to help working families really balance work and life well, you get these falling birth rates. And when you have a society that feels that it cannot even create the next generation, what have you created? We say that we're a society of family values. Well, we really need to start valuing the families that we have.
I want to close by asking you to reflect on what you opened your book with, which is the time diary that you kept for many months. You asked an academic named John Robinson to analyze your time use, and he concluded that you actually had a lot of time for leisure, even though you didn't see it that way. And he suggested that people might say they're overwhelmed because there's this element in showing off in our culture because of this American ethic of achievement and hard work being a mark of merit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. He did. He found 27 hours of what he called leisure, and I called bits and scraps of garbagey time. And that showed me a couple things. It showed me what we've known really for a long time, what time diaries show, is that women's time has always been fragmented. It's always been interrupted, and that was really what showed up in my diary because of all of the caregiving duties and then trying to do the juggle with work. That throughout human history, leisure has required long periods of unbroken, uninterrupted time, and the people who have had access to that time have tended to be high-status men.
Right.
And so that now that we are in this kind of new era of shifting gender roles and women's independence, it's time for women to start having that kind of uninterrupted time as well, because that's where leisure in that time is where civilization has been created, and it's time for women to be part of that conversation as well.
Brigid Schulte, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Okay.